We've got a couple more talks before lunch, and I think they're going to be really good, really interesting talks. We're going to start with John Chandler from All Web Leads. He assures me that no one else has heard of them, but...
They're good, right?
Yeah. He's going to be talking about bringing Selenium to the rest of the company, which ties in really well with some of the things that Noah was talking about earlier. So I'm really looking forward to this. John, please, welcome to SeleniumConf.
Thank you. All right, so I'm going to talk today a little bit about how at All Web Leads we have managed to get different departments in the company using Selenium. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we got started with Selenium, go into a little bit of detail, I'm not going to get too technical, but I'll go into a little detail of our automation, and then I'll show you some pretty cool results we've seen from it. So just by a show of hands, how many of you have functional testers at your company using Selenium? All right, pretty good number. What about marketing teams using Selenium? And sales teams using Selenium? That's good. I was going to walk away if everybody raised their hand. All right, so I'll start off by telling you a little bit about All Web Leads. We're in Austin, Texas. You can see a picture from a plane here. Our office is right in the middle, and we're out northwest of Austin. It was founded in 2005. We deal with online insurance lead generation, and we have three major products. Those are calls, and what that is a consumer shopping for insurance online. They fill out one of our forms, and somebody from our call center calls them almost immediately, verifies their information, and then connects them over the phone with an insurance agent looking to sell insurance to them. We also deal with clicks, and that's going to be outbound advertising traffic. And then leads are traditional sales leads generated online, connecting consumers that are looking for insurance with the agents looking to sell insurance to them. We have 66 employees right now, or when I made this slide we did. About 20 of those are in the engineering department. 39 of those are in the sales and marketing departments combined. We operate over 350 LeadGen websites. They all have different brands targeting different audiences. And it turns out the back-end systems are pretty complex, which I know I didn't expect going into it when I started working there, but there's a lot of complex logic in there. And our engineering team operates on an agile release cycle of 2 weeks. So let's rewind to 2010 when I joined the company. We were definitely doing it wrong as far as testing goes. Almost all of the testing that was done was completely manual. We had a little bit of automation, even a little Selenium, but it was not well maintained, it wasn't very well written, and it definitely was not regularly executed. Back then, escapes were too common, and we just kind of had to live with it. So we really got serious about automation in August of 2010. Our first project was to create a live website monitor. Which is something that was kind of covered in the previous talk a little bit. And we decided to use Selenium for that. So you can see here on the right side is one of our auto forms. It's pretty basic. Its purpose is to collect all the information that an insurance agent is going to need to quote you on auto insurance. So we came up with a product called the LeadGen Monitor. And its purpose was to constantly monitor the consumer workflows on our websites. So it did exactly what a normal consumer does. It finds our landing pages, fills it out, submits it, goes to the quote form, fills that out, submits that as well, and then verifies that a lead was created in the database. It does a lot of checking along the way to make sure that everything's loading properly. It verifies every single individual element was loaded properly on the page, alerts us if something wasn't. It was originally designed to detect some infrastructure problems we were having at the time. Just random intermittent failures that would take our websites down, either very briefly, sometimes for long periods of time, requiring manual intervention. It was really successful at that, and you can see here is an example of a text message alert that would be fired if something broke for more than a couple of tests. This was in fact so successful that right now we have 3 of these running at over double the speed that they used to. So every minute we have a full consumer workflow being executed 3 times from multiple regions around the country. And it's proved to be very useful to us. So one thing that it did that we didn't really intend for it to do was it was finding bugs that were introduced into the production workflow. This is my favorite. Found a bunch, but this one was probably the biggest. In the top left, you can see the before, and in the bottom right, you can see the after. That go button is what takes you from the landing page to the quote form. When that's not there, consumers get pretty confused. This is a problem that was introduced late on a Friday and probably would not have been noticed until Monday at the earliest. Due to a couple of different reasons, there's a good chance it could have gone on longer. There's a chance it could have been caught earlier. No guarantee. It's kind of hard to judge how long a bug will live in production once you've found it. So this was really one of our first big functional test successes with Selenium. So we decided to see what we could do with it. And here's a little example of some of the code behind the LeadGen Monitor, kind of used in a different way. But we built up a pretty reusable code base, very basic, nothing too complex. Oops. And you can see here, we have two objects. One of them represents a lead. One of them contains all of the Selenium code required to fill out the form. You pass in the lead data to the quote object. You call a couple of simple functions, and everything's done for you. And the advantage of how we built it that way is that the Selenium code behind it can change, but our tests don't. So a couple of years, or I think it was sometime last year, we migrated from Selenium RC to WebDriver Selenium. And the code for the LeadGen Monitor really didn't need to change at all. So you can see here I have a little test program that's purpose is to fill out an auto quote form. And doing that by hand is something that was extremely common to everybody at All Web Leads, especially the engineers. It's extremely slow and very tedious. And that can have an impact on the testing that you're doing, just because if you're doing something over and over again with 50 different form fields on a single web form, and you need to specifically set 2 of them, but you don't care about the rest, you're going to start making mistakes pretty quickly as you just kind of zone out filling out the forms. So some of us started writing these little test programs using the code that was built for the LeadGen Monitor. It's by no means an automated test, but it's automating the slow parts of a manual test. So say we needed to test routing some leads with a lot of DUIs on them. Well, we need to configure our environment a little bit. That's pretty quick. Normally takes a couple of minutes, especially if you're just dealing with a couple of customers. Step 2 is generate a bunch of leads. You can see in this program I'm generating, it looks like about 12 leads. And each of these leads involves multiple web forms. Each DUI that's added to the lead is a new form to collect the details of that. And then at the end, you verify the leads are routed correctly. And that's a fairly simple step as well. It's generally just looking in the database a little bit to make sure things happened as they should have. So this was pretty useful when you're doing a lot of testing, especially when you're doing a lot of the same testing, but a lot of the developers didn't really find a use for it just because they would write their feature, test it with a lead or 2, and then they'd be done with it. So it wasn't really widely adopted by all the members of the engineering team. Definitely not by any of the other teams in the company either. And these one-off test programs weren't really getting us anywhere. They were saving some time in the short run, but it's nothing that we saved. It was nothing that was really reusable. So one day I decided to try to make it easier, and I started a new WinForm app in Visual Studio. And this is what I came up with. This is a program that is affectionately known as Jelli around the office. And the backstory on that is in 2010, we got attacked pretty badly out of Asia by some just quote form spammers. I can't remember exactly what they were after, probably ad revenue. But they submitted a lot of leads, thousands of leads to our systems with the name Jelli on them. So given that that's the purpose of this app, one of the developers named it Jelli. So what you can see here is that I've basically duplicated the auto form that you saw a couple of slides ago. It's not very pretty, it's just meant to be functional, but it has all of the same fields. And all of the possible options for each of the fields are on this form for you. And this is an example of the home form in Jelli. Nothing too complicated. Again, it's just duplicating the quote form functionality, which you see here. On the left is the home form. Hopefully you can see that. It's got all the same fields that you just saw on Jelli. And on the right is the health form, which you can see here in Jelli. It's just really taking everything relevant to health insurance. And here's life. So you may see these buttons in the bottom right corner. One of them says Submit Lead, and that does exactly what you would think it does. You click that button, and Selenium starts up, opens up a browser for you, fills out the forms, submits the lead, closes it, you're done. You've got a test lead in your system. The other button, Fill Quote Form, is a little more useful, at least for front-end testing. And what that does is it opens up the browser, navigates to the landing page, submits that, fills out the quote form, and then just leaves the browser for you to use. So this is giving you a test step that would normally be really slow and doing that part for you, and then leaving the rest of the steps up to you. And it actually proved to be extremely useful. So just to talk about what we've done at this point at All Web Leads, this is late 2010. Old testing, extremely tedious. Like I mentioned before, and I'll talk about this forever, filling out quote forms over and over and over again, or whatever your web forms might be, that's just, it's boring. And you're going to kind of zone out while you're doing it, and you're going to start making mistakes. And particularly in our system, when you make a mistake, it can be extremely difficult to figure it out, because you filled out a form, you submitted it, and your test failed. Now you got to figure out why your test failed. Figuring out that it was you made a mistake filling out the form is not always the easiest thing to do. The other thing is that most of the test leads generated by hand in our system have most of the same data, simply because we got really good at hitting the tab button and then the down button just to go through all of the different drop downs, and then just banging on the keyboards for the name fields. And there wasn't much useful data going on in our manual testing. Now we introduced Jelli, and filling out the quote forms is actually kind of fun, because people that have never seen Selenium work before are interested in it, because they see a browser doing something automatically that they've been doing manually for a long time, and they've never really been exposed to stuff like this. So it kind of had a cool factor when we first introduced it. Still pretty easy to mess up filling out the form in Jelli, just because it's a big form with a lot of fields. But after you submit the lead, you can go back to Jelli and you see exactly what you did. So that makes it a little easier. You're also not dealing with the tedious factor, so you're not zoning out when you're filling out Jelli. You're doing it once, and then you're pushing a button, and everything happens automatically. So the other thing that Jelli got us is randomization when filling out the forms. And this has caught several bugs over the years, things that we were not intending to test. Jelli's filling out random fields, the things that you don't care about, and all of a sudden something breaks, and you go back and you figure out what. If you don't want randomization, all you have to do is fill out the entire form on Jelli. So the engineering team started using Jelli pretty quickly. It did not take much to convince them that this was a useful tool. And they almost immediately started requesting features. So one of the cool features that was first requested is the replay functionality. It's exactly what it sounds like. You point Jelli at an environment, you point it to a lead, and it replays in your environment exactly what was done to submit that lead in the first place. And this has proved extremely useful for tracking down production issues and fixing them as fast as possible. Because the old way of look up the lead in our admin console and then try to fill it out the same way, that takes a long time and you are going to make mistakes. So we also added better IE and Chrome support. We had to write a little bit of code for each of those to make it work smoothly inside of this application. We also added multi-threaded submission, and what that does is it was letting the back-end testers or the back-end developers test their features quickly by just generating a lot of leads through the normal consumer workflow. At that point, they weren't really focused on actually verifying anything on the form or any of the front-end behavior. You just needed to generate leads. And with 4 submission threads running, you could generate between 10 and 20 leads per minute through the normal consumer workflow with either targeted or completely random data. Also added custom Firefox profiles for this, and that's proved pretty useful for our web developers because they have a bunch of different Firefox plugins they use while they're developing their code. Now they can use those plugins when using Jelli. We also had to add some safety checks because some people were spamming production with test leads, and our agents don't like that. And they call and complain a lot when we sell them test leads. So what's next? So this is a graph of bugs reported by the QA team against our engineering web projects in Jira, which is our bug tracking system. So you can see in 2010, we had over 200 bugs reported by the QA team. This is with almost no automation, and for the first half of 2010, there was only one person on the QA team. I joined halfway through 2010 and became the second, and that was it for the rest of 2010. Jelli was introduced late in 2010, and while there were also some process changes that went into effect, it looks like it had a pretty profound impact on the number of bugs that were making it to QA and to production. 2012, you can see the number went up a little bit. It's because we introduced a new product, a new CMS, and we started redesigning and rewriting all of our landing pages and our quote forms. I actually took the CMS project out of the query I was using, and the number continued to go down, but it's not really fair to just leave out data because it makes it look good. So in 2013, we're on track to have our best year ever, which is pretty cool. So we're having success with this on the engineering team. What else can we do? Well, the marketing team's making changes to our live websites. The sales team's making changes to our live websites. So let's give this tool to them. So we started with marketing, and you can see from this graph that it's helping. So marketing doesn't really have they don't have a QA team for sure. I don't have a lot of insight into their process, but they're in charge of the content of our websites, A/B testing. They can make some workflow changes, stuff like that. And that's pretty much what Jelli was originally designed to do, was work through the normal consumer workflow. So as you can see from this graph, in 2010, the QA team caught over 35 marketing bugs, and we're not testing for any of their changes. Generally, when we find a marketing bug, it's by accident, and a lot of times it's already in production. So in 2010, and remember there was only one QA member for the first half of that, we found 37 bugs, a lot of those in production. 2011, which is early 2011, is when we introduced this tool to marketing. We cut that in half. 2012, we cut it in half again. And as of whenever I made this slide a few weeks ago, in 2013, the QA team has not reported a single bug to the marketing department's project, which is pretty amazing. And Jelli definitely can't take credit for all of this, but it's helping, and it seems to be helping a lot. The sales team is in charge of our advertising. Or rather managing our outbound advertising. So after a consumer, or during the consumer experience on our websites, advertising can be presented at a few different times, and it's all very targeted to what the consumer is looking for. This specific example is for a consumer to actually get online quotes for the insurance type that they're looking for. Our service is primarily focused at connecting you with insurance agents that don't have an online presence. But there are definitely companies out there that do, and that's the kind of things that the sales department is in charge of. So you can see here that this is one of the displays that somebody might see after they fill out a form on our website. This generates a lot of revenue, and problems with it can cost a lot of money pretty quickly. So the sales team uses Jelli to fill out forms and see what the consumer sees. They're also pretty dependent on the LeadGen Monitor, which goes through the normal consumer workflow 3 times a minute now, and it takes screenshots of the traffic displays. So the sales team uses the results of that a lot too, to to track down issues and just make sure things are working properly. So I just covered 2010 to 2011. That's about all the history I'm going to go through, but just a brief overview. We've added a bunch of ways to create leads in our system, and we just continuously update JLead to do all of those, or to use all of those. It's regularly used by about a third of the company. I would say 19 out of 20 of the engineers use it at least weekly, a lot of them daily. The sales and the marketing teams, they don't use it as often, but they definitely do use it regularly still. Actually, right before I left for here, I was helping one of the marketing people fix it. They were having some problems with a new version of Firefox came out that we hadn't updated to support yet. And JLead's generated tens of millions of leads in our system, which is pretty cool because before JLead, it was very, very difficult to generate leads. Now, most of those have not been quote form leads driven by Selenium. They've been submitted through our lead creation APIs that are still relatively new, but it's still a lot of leads. The other thing that's changed since 2011 is that JLead has become an actual project supported by the entire engineering team. It started out as kind of almost a hobby, and now it's become so useful to the business that everybody works on it. Everybody adds features to it, especially when they add new things to the system. As far as automation goes, we went from almost nothing to having a pretty good automated regression suite that runs nightly. It's about half Selenium, half just lower level API testing. But that's pretty cool too. And it's built on the exact same code that JLead is, which turns out to save a lot of time. So JLead doesn't get any code written for it. It's all code written for our automated regression suite, and then JLead just uses it. And we very rarely get to, because we're on a 2-week release cycle, we don't get to automate testing for features as they're going out. It's just not realistic. Right now we've got 2 automation developers and something like a dozen feature developers. We just can't keep up. So what we do is we build up the automation code base to test the new features, and then if we think it's necessary, we will add that code to JLead and make it so that the manual test process is a lot faster, more accurate, and catches bugs better. So I'm going to go over why I think JLead is successful, and some of these are points I've already mentioned. But first thing, it uses the code we already built for our automated tests. That really makes it easy to justify adding features to JLead because the same code is going to be used to create new regression tests. JLead's pretty easy to maintain because it's on the same code base. If we have to maintain a test, JLead gets those updates. It's pretty quick to add features, just using the drag and drop WinForm builder in Visual Studio. It's really nothing fancy. So we don't spend a lot of time adding things to the UI. I probably don't need to mention this next point to this audience, but it improves testing, and that's good. So I'll leave it at that. For the user, it has a pretty low learning curve. You saw it. I'm sure I could give this application to anyone in this room, and they could start using it immediately. Because it's also easy to use. You look at it, it looks like one of our web forms. You click a button, and it goes, which is pretty cool. It reliably produces the exact same test steps each time. That's if you want it to. You can also have randomization. And that's really valuable for tracking down issues, because if you're relying on yourself to manually fill out the form the same way every time, you're going to do it wrong. You're going to have inconsistent results. And that's not good for the manual test process or the development process. It's going to slow everybody down. For the user, this is probably the biggest advantage, and that is that the most tedious part of manual testing has been automated for you. You're still manually testing things, you're still configuring on your own, you're still verifying on your own, but those are relatively quick compared to filling out 10 of our forms. And the most important reason that JLead is successful for us is that we update it constantly. So as a new feature is developed, we decide whether or not we think that we need to be able to test it quickly and accurately in JLead. A lot of the time the answer is yes. So an example of a time that we've done this recently is we added new lead types to our system. And this is something that it may sound fairly simple, but it definitely was not. And we had to do it quickly. This was an unexpected requirement coming out of the business. And I think we had something like a week to do it. So the automation team worked with the developers to write the automation to test these new forms and the new back-end systems as they were being developed by the developers. And as a result of that, Jelli was filling out these forms and submitting these leads hours after that was checked in, which was a pretty cool accomplishment for the engineering team at All Web Leads. And similarly, I mentioned that we brought up a new CMS system and we started rewriting a bunch of our landing pages and quote forms. There was a lot of back-end work done to support that as well. And we started automating that as soon as the code started being written by the developers. And as a result of that, they published a specification and we consumed it. And we actually had the code base built to test it before they had the code base built to be tested. And we considered that a pretty big win as well. And that allowed us to get the features inside of Jelli very, very quickly and allow people to start testing these new quote forms and the new workflows very, very quickly. You can see an example of one of the new lead submission systems that we built to support the new quote forms. And instead of just taking all the information at once and filling it in a database, we can now submit pieces of leads in whatever order we want, and then they get assembled by the back end and turned into a lead whenever the front end says it's done. And Jelli can do that as well without going through a quote form now, which really speeds up the testing. So what else can it do? Pretty much anything you'd want to test at All Web Leads, or rather things that you would need to test but you don't want to because they're slow or tedious or complicated, Jelli can help with. And this has been another key to its success. If you need to test something, check to see if it can do it in Jelli. It may be on a tab that you've never seen before, you've never had reason to click on. I've had so many people ask me, is there a good way to test this? And I say, yeah, it's been inside of Jelli for 6 months now. And they're always surprised by that. But it's pretty cool that it's kind of the one stop for testing everything in our system. So this is a screenshot of what Jelli looks like today. The screenshots I was showing you were from 2010, and it consisted of just 4 tabs for each of our major quote type, or lead types rather. The one you're looking at right now is that new lead type that we added, I talked about just a minute ago. And you can see it's got a total of 13 tabs now, and that pretty much covers almost everything you would ever need to do in our system. From testing with Selenium, backend APIs, web services. It even has a tab there at the end, environment, that will set up your environment in specific configurations that mimic production settings. That's all I've got. Does anyone have any questions? CAPTCHA. That is actually something that we experimented with back in the days that we were getting some massive fraud from overseas. We added it to some of our websites, but only for very specific workflows, and it's not really supported by Jelli. That is something that you have to test on your own. But because it's not the common case, it's not really something that we feel Jelli needs to do. We actually investigated ways to kind of allow Jelli to bypass that process, and it just didn't seem like it was worth the time investment because it's not a common case. You can definitely do that in Jelli with any of these fields that are just text boxes. You can put whatever you want into those fields. The drop-downs, those have controlled data on the form. In order for somebody to actually submit bad data to those, they would have to go in and they can modify it with like Firebug. But that's not really something that happens very often either. Now the other tabs, which I could show you, but I'm running low on time here. They allow you to post to our web services, backend APIs directly, and they let you specify whatever data you want. They will generate test data that's perfectly valid, and then they let you change it however you want. So if you want to try submitting a bad JSON string, like the one I showed you a few slides ago, you're perfectly capable of doing that. If you want to put bad data into that, like for instance, a lot of our lead data is confined to some enums. You can change that data and submit it and make sure that the backend system errors out appropriately. So it definitely lets you do some negative testing. Anyone else?
So it looks like this is a form that just allows you to create data for your system. So does this actually fire off a Selenium script that somehow grabs this data that you filled out?
It works the exact same way our automation does. Everything's built up in .NET. When you click that button, it creates an object that represents the lead, and it creates an object that controls Selenium. It brings up Firefox just like a normal test would, or Chrome or IE, whatever you want it to do, and then fills out the form just like Selenium does, or like our tests do.
Can you save the data and reload data to modify it as well?
No, and that's not really something anyone's ever asked for. It's generally just easier to start over. Like I showed you the replay functionality, or I talked about it, and that seems to be enough for people that need to use historic data. If you just need to work on specific types of data or specific inputs, then you fill them out in the form and you just click in it, or you tell it to go. Anyone else? It's done in code. So he asked if we're doing anything, or how do we randomize our data? And basically, the way it started is I actually wrote a script that went through and it scraped all the different form entry fields from our websites and generated lists of strings to be used with Selenium. And that's one way we do it, is when you create a new lead object, it just randomly picks data. We have several different lead representations now. They all get random data in different ways. Some of them are based on XML schemas, and we have the possible data defined there, and the randomization just picks something from those fields. And then if the Selenium code gets to the form and the data is missing for like a drop-down, it will just pick one of the things that's on the form. That's not really a normal case. You should have data for that field by the time you get to the form, but in case you don't, it will just be randomly selected. All right, thank you. I'm out of time.